The gleaming marble floors of the Pentagon's executive corridor reflected my polished dress uniform as I walked toward Conference Room Alpha 7, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff waited for my briefing on the Syrian extraction operation that had just saved 43 American hostages. The same woman who had once chosen a Wall Street banker over a broken soldier now sat among the nation's highest military officials. Completely unaware that Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ghost Reeves, the man whose tactical innovations had revolutionized modern warfare, was the same David Chen she had discarded 8 years ago when I returned from Kandahar with a limp and nightmares instead of the successful career she had expected. The irony wasn't lost on me that Secretary of Defense Sarah Hamilton, my former fiancée, would be personally debriefing me on an operation that the President himself had called the most flawlessly executed rescue mission in modern military history. She had no idea that the decorated Special Operations Commander standing before her was the same man she had abandoned at Walter Reed Medical Center, choosing instead the comfort and prestige of marrying Jonathan Hamilton, whose family fortune and political connections promised her the Washington power she craved. The woman who had once told me that she needed someone whole, someone with a future, now depended on my strategic brilliance to maintain America's military superiority across 3 continents. 8 years ago, Sarah Mitchell had been everything I thought I wanted: brilliant, ambitious, beautiful. With a law degree from Georgetown and connections that stretched from Capitol Hill to Manhattan's financial district, we had met during my first deployment to Afghanistan, and she was working as a JAG officer and I was a young captain leading reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. She had written letters filled with promises of a future together, speaking of the life we would build when I returned, the career we would share in military law, the family we would raise. Those letters had kept me alive through 3 tours of duty, through firefights in Helmand Province, through the Eid explosion that shattered my left leg and killed 2 of my best friends. But the man who returned from that final deployment wasn't the same confident officer who had left. The David Chen who limped off that transport plane at Andrews Air Force Base carried shrapnel in his leg and ghosts in his mind, struggling with PTSD that made him wake up screaming in panic attacks that struck without warning. The promising military career that Sarah had envisioned was derailed by medical evaluations and fitness boards, by months of physical therapy and psychological counseling. Instead of the rising star she had planned to marry, she found herself engaged to a broken soldier whose future looked uncertain at best. The conversation that ended our engagement took place in my hospital room at Walter Reed, while I was still learning to walk properly again. Sarah had arrived dressed impeccably as always, her auburn hair perfectly styled, wearing the blue dress I had once told her made her eyes look like sapphires. But her expression was cold, businesslike, the same look she wore when delivering bad news to clients. She had spoken about compatibility and life goals. It's about needing someone who could provide stability and advancement opportunities. She had used words like realistic and practical, explaining that she couldn't sacrifice her own career prospects to support someone whose military future was so uncertain. "I need someone whole, David," she had said, her voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Someone who can be a partner in building the kind of life I've worked so hard to achieve. You're not that person anymore, and we both know it." The engagement ring had made a small, clinking sound when she placed it on the bedside table next to my pain medication. "Jonathan Hamilton has offered me a position with his father's firm, and we've been growing close. He can give me the life I've always wanted, the connections, the opportunities, the future. I'm sorry, but I have to think about my own career now." Jonathan Hamilton represented everything I wasn't: inherited wealth, Ivy League connections, a guaranteed path to political power through his family's influence. His father was a former defense secretary, his uncle a sitting senator. His trust fund worth more than I would earn in 10 lifetimes of military service. Sarah had met him at a Washington charity gala while I was recovering from my 3rd surgery, and the attraction had been immediate and obvious. Where I offered uncertainty and struggle, he offered security and advancement. Where I came with trauma and limitation, he came with privilege and possibility. I hadn't fought for her. I hadn't begged or pleaded or tried to convince her that our love was worth the challenges ahead. Instead, I had simply nodded, wished her happiness, and watched her walk out of my life with the same calm acceptance I had learned in combat when facing impossible odds. Some battles I knew weren't meant to be won through force or desperation. Some victories required a different kind of strategy, a longer timeline, a more complete transformation of the battlefield itself. The months that followed Sarah's departure were the darkest of my life, darker even than the nights in Afghanistan. When Taliban mortar lit up the sky like deadly fireworks, the military medical board had determined that my injuries made me unfit for active combat duty, effectively ending the career that had defined my identity since graduating from West Point. The Army offered me a desk job, pushing papers and reviewing reports, the kind of bureaucratic purgatory that kills the soul of every warrior who finds himself trapped behind it. The future that Sarah had seen, so clearly a broken man with limited prospects and diminishing relevance, seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. But desperation, I discovered, could be its own form of motivation. If I couldn't serve my country in the traditional way, if the conventional path to military leadership was closed to me, then I would forge a new path entirely. I began studying unconventional warfare, asymmetric tactics, the kind of strategies that small forces use to defeat larger ones through superior intelligence and innovative thinking. My disability pension was modest, but it was enough to live on while I pursued advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies, attending night classes at Georgetown while spending my days researching insurgency tactics and counter-terrorism methods. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was gradual, methodical, built on countless hours of study and analysis, on developing new frameworks for understanding modern warfare that traditional military doctrine had failed to address. I wrote papers on urban combat tactics that caught the attention of Pentagon strategists. I developed training protocols for special operations that reduced casualty rates by 40%. I created intelligence gathering techniques that revolutionized how we tracked terrorist networks across multiple countries and jurisdictions. My first real breakthrough came when a classified document had authored on Taliban supply chain disruption was passed up the chain of command and eventually landed on the desk of General Patricia Morrison, head of Special Operations Command. She had been struggling with a particularly complex situation in Syria, where traditional military approaches had failed to locate and rescue a group of American contractors being held by a sophisticated terrorist cell. Operational patterns, their funding sources, and their likely hiding locations proved instrumental in planning the rescue mission that brought all 6 hostages home safely. General Morrison became my mentor and advocate, recognizing that my unique perspective, combining traditional military training with innovative strategic thinking, could be invaluable in addressing the complex challenges of modern warfare. She arranged for my transfer to Special Operations Command, where my disabilities were seen not as limitations, but as evidence of my combat experience and dedication to service. The limp that had once marked me as broken became a badge of honor among operators who respected anyone who had bled for his country. The years that followed were a blur of classified missions and strategic innovations, of briefings with cabinet members and consultations with foreign military leaders. I developed new approaches to hostage rescue that were adopted by NATO forces across Europe. I created training programs that prepared special operations teams for the psychological challenges of urban warfare. I wrote the tactical manual that became required reading for every special forces unit in the American military, and several allied nations as well. My reputation grew quietly, but steadily within the defense establishment. Military officers who had never heard of David Chen knew the name Marcus Ghost Reeves, the mysterious special operations commander whose unconventional tactics had achieved success rates that seemed almost impossible. The nickname had come from my ability to plan operations that left no trace, missions so precisely executed that they appeared almost supernatural in their efficiency. Hostages were rescued from seemingly impregnable locations. Terrorist networks were dismantled without anyone understanding how their security had been breached. High-value targets were eliminated or captured with surgical precision that left observers wondering if they had been watching reality or some elaborate magic trick. The physical rehabilitation had been only the beginning of my transformation. I had rebuilt not just my body but my entire identity, evolving from a conventional infantry officer into something far more dangerous and effective. The trauma that Sarah had seen as a weakness became the foundation of my psychological strength, teaching me to operate effectively under extreme stress and to make critical decisions when lives hung in the balance. The injury that had ended my conventional military career became the catalyst for developing new approaches to warfare that transcended traditional limitations. Now, as I approached the conference room where Sarah waited with the other senior defense officials, I carried with me the knowledge that I had become exactly what she had claimed was an impossible whole, successful, and more valuable to my country than I had ever been before her betrayal. The broken soldier she had abandoned had transformed into the most respected special operations commander of his generation, the man whose strategic brilliance had redefined how America conducted its most sensitive military operations around the world. The story began in the autumn of 2014, when I was Captain David Chen, a 28-year-old reconnaissance officer stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan's Khost province. I had graduated third in my class from West Point, earned a Ranger tab and airborne qualification, and spent the previous 4 years leading some of the most dangerous missions along the Pakistan border. My record was spotless, my fitness reports exemplary, and my future in the Army seemed limitless. More importantly, I was engaged to marry Sarah Mitchell, the brilliant JAG Corps attorney who had captured my heart during a brief leave in Kabul. 6 months earlier, Sarah was everything I had ever dreamed of in a partner, sharp-witted, fiercely intelligent, and ambitious in ways that complemented my own drive for excellence. She had grown up in Alexandria, Virginia, as the daughter of a State Department official and a federal judge, surrounded by the kind of Washington sophistication that I had only glimpsed from the outside. Her law degree from Georgetown had been followed by a commission as a judge advocate general, where she specialized in military justice and international law. When we met at a briefing on rules of engagement for special operations, I was immediately struck not just by her beauty, but by the precision of her legal mind and her genuine understanding of the complexities facing soldiers in combat zones. Courtship had been conducted primarily through letters and video calls, punctuated by brief leaves when we could meet in Bagram or Dubai for a few precious days together. She wrote to me about her work defending soldiers accused of various infractions, about the legal challenges of operating in a war zone where the rules of engagement seemed to shift daily, about her plans for transitioning to civilian practice after her military service ended. I wrote to her about the missions I could describe, about the landscape of Afghanistan that was both beautiful and terrifying, about the men I led and the responsibility I felt for bringing them home safely. The engagement had happened during my mid-tour leave in January 2014, and I had managed to coordinate a week's vacation in Dubai with Sarah's leave schedule. I had proposed on the beach at sunset, presenting her with a ring I had spent 3 months' salary to buy, a 2-carat diamond that caught the Arabian Gulf's golden light like a captured star. She had said yes without hesitation, crying tears of joy as she talked about the life we would build together after our respective deployments ended. We had planned a wedding for the following spring, discussed the possibility of her joining a prestigious Washington law firm while I pursued advanced military education, perhaps at the Command and General Staff College, or even a graduate degree at one of the war colleges. Those plans sustained me through the long nights on patrol, through the constant tension of operating in territory where every shadow might conceal an insurgent and every piece of debris on the road might hide an improvised explosive device. Sarah's letters were my connection to a world beyond the endless cycle of missions and casualties. Her voice on our weekly calls a reminder that there was something beautiful and peaceful waiting for me beyond the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan. She represented not just love but hope, the possibility that a soldier could serve his country with honor and still build a meaningful life beyond the battlefield. My final mission began on a crisp October morning when intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was meeting with foreign fighters in a compound near the village of Toni, just 15 kilometers from the Pakistani border. The target, known by the code name Red Falcon, was believed to be coordinating attacks. against coalition convoys and had been responsible for at least 6 American deaths in the previous month. The mission briefing emphasized the importance of capturing him alive if possible, as his intelligence value was considered extremely high by both CIA analysts and Special Operations Command. I led a 12-man reconnaissance team on what should have been a routine surveillance operation, establishing overwatch positions on the ridgeline above the target compound to confirm Red Falcon's presence before calling in a larger capture team. The terrain was typical of eastern Afghanistan, rocky mountainous, offering excellent concealment but limited escape routes if things went wrong. My men were veterans of dozens of similar operations, experienced soldiers who moved through the landscape like ghosts, invisible to the enemy forces. Operating in the valley below, the operation proceeded flawlessly for the first 18 hours. We had positive identification of Red Falcon, confirmation of at least 8 other fighters in the compound, and detailed intelligence on their weapons and defensive positions. The capture team was en route, expected to arrive before dawn for an assault that would take the insurgents completely by surprise. Everything was going according to plan until the moment when Sergeant Mike Torres, my team's communications specialist, stepped on a pressure plate IED that had been concealed beneath a pile of rocks on what appeared to be a natural walking path. The explosion was devastating in its precision and power. Torres was killed instantly, his body torn apart by the blast that sent shrapnel flying in all directions. Corporal James Wu, who had been walking 3 meters behind him, was critically wounded. His legs shattered, and his abdomen torn open by metal fragments that had cut through his body armor like tissue paper. The blast also triggered a coordinated ambush by insurgent forces who had apparently been tracking our movements for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. Within seconds, my team was engaged in a desperate firefight against an enemy force that outnumbered us at least 3 to 1. Machine gun fire raked our positions from multiple directions, while rocket-propelled grenades exploded around us with terrifying accuracy. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as it became clear that we were not just facing the insurgents from the compound, but a much larger force that had been positioned specifically to target American reconnaissance teams operating in the area. The next 4 hours were a blur of combat, medical evacuation procedures, and tactical decisions made. Under extreme pressure, I coordinated air support from Apache helicopters while simultaneously directing my team's withdrawal from what had become an untenable position. Wu was bleeding out despite our field medic's best efforts, requiring immediate evacuation to a surgical facility if he had any chance of survival. The casualty evacuation helicopter took heavy fire during both its approach and departure. With the crew chief wounded and several rounds punching through the aircraft's engine compartment, it was during the final phase of our withdrawal, as we were moving to a secondary landing zone for extraction, that the second IED detonated beneath my feet. I had been point man for the movement, checking each step carefully for signs of disturbance. When the device exploded with enough force to lift me 3 feet into the air and slam me back down onto the rocky ground with crushing impact, the pain was immediate and overwhelming, radiating from my left leg up through my entire body like liquid fire. The medevac helicopter that carried me away from that Afghan mountainside marked the end of one life and the beginning of a descent into darkness that I could never have imagined. The flight to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany was a haze of morphine and emergency surgery, with military surgeons working frantically to save a leg that had been shattered into 17 separate pieces by the eyed blast. The titanium rod they inserted ran from my knee to my ankle, held in place by screws and pins that would set off metal detectors for the rest of my life. A permanent reminder of the moment when my future had exploded along with that hidden bomb. The physical injuries were only the beginning of my problems. The traumatic brain injury from the blast's concussion had left me with severe headaches, memory gaps, and a hypersensitivity to loud sounds that made normal conversation feel like being trapped inside a thunderstorm. Sleep became impossible without medication, as every time I closed my eyes I was back on that mountain, hearing Torres scream in the split second before the explosion tore him apart, watching Wu's blood seep into the rocky soil while I desperately tried to coordinate his evacuation. The nightmares were so vivid and terrifying that I began staying awake for days at a time,
Ow.
surviving on caffeine and sheer willpower, until exhaustion finally forced me into unconsciousness. The Army's Medical Evaluation Board convened 3 months. After my return to Walter Reed, a panel of doctors and officers who reviewed my case with the cold efficiency of an insurance claims adjustment. They examined my medical records, observed my physical therapy sessions, and administered psychological tests that measured my fitness for continued military service. The conclusion was inevitable, but still devastating when delivered in the sterile conference room where my fate was decided. Captain David Chen was medically unfit for combat duty and would be offered a disability retirement with a 70% rating, effective immediately. 20-8 years old in my military career. It was over. The Army that had been my entire adult identity, the institution that had given me purpose and direction since I was 18, no longer had a place for me. The desk jobs they offered were transparent charity, meaningless positions pushing paperwork, while younger, healthier officers took on the missions I had once led. The thought of spending the next 20 years filing reports and attending safety briefings was more terrifying than any combat operation I'd ever faced in Afghanistan. Sarah's visits to Walter Reed became increasingly infrequent as the reality of my condition became clear. Where she had once arrived with flowers and optimistic talk about our future together, she now came with forced smiles and careful questions about my medical progress. I could see the doubt growing in her eyes as she watched me struggle through physical therapy sessions, as she witnessed the panic attacks that struck without warning, as she realized that the confident officer she had fallen in love with might never fully return. The conversations became stilted and awkward, filled with long silences where unspoken concerns hung in the air like toxic gas. Sarah would ask about my treatment timeline with the practiced neutrality of a lawyer taking depositions, carefully avoiding any discussion of our wedding plans or the life we had once envisioned together. She spoke instead about her own career prospects, about the opportunities that were opening up for ambitious attorneys in Washington's competitive legal market, about the importance of making strategic decisions about her professional future. End came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March, when Sarah arrived at my hospital room, wearing the blue suit she had worn to our engagement party. Her expression businesslike and final. She had accepted a position with Hamilton, Blackstone, and Associates, the prestigious firm where Jonathan Hamilton worked as a senior partner. Jonathan was everything I was not. Harvard Law School, family connections stretching back to the founding fathers, inherited wealth that guaranteed him a place in Washington's elite social circles regardless of his actual legal abilities. She delivered the news with the same professional detachment she had once used to brief commanding officers on legal matters. The engagement was over, she explained, because their circumstances had changed in ways that made their original plans impossible. She needed someone who could be a true partner in building the kind of career she had always envisioned, someone whose own trajectory would complement rather than complicate her ambitions. Jonathan offered stability, connections, and a shared vision of success that she found compelling and realistic. "You're not the same person I fell in love with," she said, her voice steady and emotionless. The David I knew was confident, ambitious, someone with a clear future ahead of him. That person doesn't exist anymore, and we both need to accept that reality. I can't build my life around taking care of someone who may never be whole again. The engagement ring made a small metallic sound when she placed it on the bedside table, next to the prescription bottles that had become my constant companions. She wished me well with genuine sincerity, hoped that I would find peace and purpose in whatever came next, but made it clear that her future lay elsewhere. Jonathan Hamilton could give her the Washington lifestyle she craved, the social status that came with his family name, the financial security that would allow her to pursue high-profile cases without worrying about practical concerns like mortgage, payments, or medical bills. I watched her walk away from my hospital bed with the same calm detachment I had learned to employ when processing battlefield casualties. Some losses, I understood, were simply facts to be accepted rather than tragedies to be mourned. Sarah had made a rational decision based on changed circumstances. Choosing security and advancement over uncertainty and struggle, she had looked at her options with the analytical precision of a trained attorney and selected the path that offered the greatest likelihood of achieving her personal and professional goals. The months that followed were the darkest period of my adult life, darker even than the immediate aftermath of the IED explosion that had shattered my leg and ended my military career. The disability payments from the Veterans Administration were sufficient to cover basic living expenses, but insufficient to maintain any semblance of the life I had once envisioned. The small apartment I rented in Arlington was a far cry from the house Sarah and I had planned to buy in McLean, the sparse furnishings a reminder of dreams that had died along with my military future. Depression settled over me like a heavy blanket, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming and pointless. Physical therapy appointments became exercises in futility, attempts to restore function to a leg that would never again carry me up a mountain or through a combat zone. The therapists were encouraging and professional, but we all understood that the goal was management rather than recovery, adaptation rather than restoration. I was learning to live with permanent limitations, to accept that the man I had been was gone forever. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of my new reality. The Army had been my family, my social circle, my entire identity for over a decade. Civilian life felt foreign and unwelcoming, filled with people who had no understanding of what I had experienced or what I had lost. Former colleagues occasionally reached out with awkward phone calls or brief visits, but the gulf between their continuing military careers and my civilian exile made meaningful connection impossible. They were moving forward while I remained trapped in the past, defined by an injury rather than by achievements or potential. The turning point came 6 months after Sarah's departure, when I found myself sitting in my Arlington apartment at 3 in the morning, staring at an empty bottle of bourbon and contemplating whether there was any point in continuing a life that seemed to offer nothing but pain and purposelessness. The disability checks covered rent and groceries, but they couldn't fill the void where my identity used to be, couldn't replace the sense of mission that had driven me since I was 18 years old. I had reached the bottom of a very deep well, and the only choice left was to start climbing or to drown in the darkness. The decision to transform myself didn't come in a flash of inspiration, but rather as a gradual recognition that I could either surrender to my circumstances or use them as the foundation for something entirely new. If the conventional path to military leadership was closed to me, then I would forge an unconventional one. If my physical limitations prevented me from returning to combat, then I would develop new ways to contribute to national security that transcended traditional battlefield roles. The injury that had ended my career as a line officer would become the catalyst for becoming something far more valuable and influential. I began by returning to school, using my GI Bill benefits to pursue a master's degree in international security studies at Georgetown University. The academic environment was initially challenging after years of practical military experience, but I discovered that my combat background gave me insights that my professors and classmates lacked. While they debated theoretical frameworks for understanding insurgency and terrorism, I had lived through the reality of fighting an adaptive enemy in complex terrain. My papers on asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency tactics earned recognition from faculty members who had advised Pentagon, officials and NATO commanders. The physical rehabilitation became secondary to its intellectual development as I immersed myself in studying the evolution of modern warfare. I analyzed successful special operations from Vietnam to Iraq, identifying patterns and principles that could be applied to contemporary challenges. My thesis on urban combat in complex environments caught the attention of researchers at the Institute for Defense Analyses, who invited me to contribute to classified studies on improving tactical effectiveness in densely populated areas. These consulting opportunities provided both additional income and access to current military thinking at the highest levels. Nights that had once been consumed by nightmares and insomnia became productive research sessions as I developed new frameworks for understanding how small, highly trained units could achieve strategic objectives against larger conventional forces. I studied the tactics used by successful insurgent groups, not to emulate them, but to understand how conventional militaries could counter their advantages. My analysis of Taliban operational methods led to insights about supply chain vulnerabilities that could be exploited by coalition forces operating with limited resources and restrictive rules of engagement. The breakthrough came when I developed a comprehensive model for predicting insurgent behavior based on economic and social factors that traditional intelligence analysis overlooked. By treating terrorist networks as business enterprises with profit motives and operational constraints, I could identify weaknesses that purely military approaches missed. This methodology proved remarkably accurate when tested against historical data from conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, correctly predicting insurgent responses to coalition tactics with an accuracy rate that exceeded existing intelligence models by over 40%. My reputation within the defense academic community grew steadily as I published papers in prestigious journals and presented findings at conferences attended by senior military officers and intelligence officials. The work was intellectually challenging and practically relevant, giving me a sense of purpose that had been missing since my medical retirement. More importantly, it demonstrated that my combat experience, rather than being a liability in civilian life, was actually an invaluable asset. When properly channeled towards strategic thinking and tactical innovation, the physical therapy continued, but with a new focus on functionality, rather than futile attempts at complete recovery. I learned to manage pain through meditation and controlled breathing techniques that also helped with the PTSD symptoms that still occasionally surfaced. The limp became less pronounced as I developed compensatory movement patterns, and the chronic pain became manageable through a combination of medication and mindfulness practices. I would never be the physical specimen I had been before the IED explosion, but I was becoming something more intellectually formidable and strategically valuable. Graduate school led to a doctoral program in strategic studies, where I focused on developing new approaches to special operations planning that incorporated lessons learned from both successful and failed missions across multiple theaters of operation. My dissertation advisor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, was a former CIA analyst who had transitioned to academic research after decades of fieldwork in Latin America and the Middle East. She understood the practical implications of theoretical work and helped me translate combat experience into scholarly frameworks that could influence policy decisions at the highest levels of government. The transformation was gradual, but profound, like physical therapy for the mind and spirit rather than just the body. Each academic achievement built upon the previous one, creating momentum that carried me forward through periods of doubt and frustration. The confidence that Sarah had seen as permanently damaged began to return, not as the reckless bravado of a young infantry officer, but as the quiet assurance of someone who had tested his ideas against reality and found them sound. I was becoming a different kind of warrior, one who fought with analysis and innovation rather than rifles and explosives. Research grants from defense contractors and government agencies provided financial stability beyond the disability payments, allowing me to rent a larger apartment and purchase the specialized computer equipment necessary for complex data analysis. The work was consuming but rewarding, offering the intellectual challenges that had been missing from my life since leaving the Army. Each project brought new insights into the nature of modern conflict and new opportunities to contribute to solutions that could save American lives in future operations. By the end of my second year in the doctoral program, I'd published 17 peer-reviewed articles on various aspects of unconventional warfare and had been invited to brief Pentagon officials on 3 separate occasions. The broken soldier that Sarah had abandoned was evolving into a respected expert whose insights were sought by the most senior military and intelligence officials in the American government. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid for something that would eventually exceed even my own expectations about what was possible. The intelligence breakthrough that would define my new career came during my 3rd year of doctoral research when I was analyzing classified after-action reports from failed hostage rescue operations across multiple theaters of operation. Working late in Georgetown's secure research facility, I noticed a pattern that had escaped the attention of traditional military analysts. Rescue missions failed not because of tactical deficiencies, but because of predictable enemy countermeasures that could be anticipated and neutralized through better operational planning. The enemy wasn't outsmarting American forces through superior combat skills. They were exploiting systematic weaknesses in how special operations were conceived and executed. My analysis revealed that terrorist organizations had developed sophisticated early warning networks that allowed them to detect and counter American rescue attempts with devastating effectiveness. These networks operated on principles borrowed from corporate intelligence gathering and organized crime, using human sources, electronic surveillance, and pattern recognition to identify when coalition forces were preparing major operations. By studying the communications intercepts and behavioral analysis from 17 failed missions, I was able to create a predictive model that identified the specific indicators terrorists used to anticipate rescue attempts. The methodology I developed treated hostage situations as complex adaptive systems, where small changes in operational approach could produce dramatically different outcomes. Instead of relying on overwhelming force and speed, which had become predictable to experienced terrorist commanders, I proposed using deception operations and misdirection to create multiple false scenarios that would confuse enemy decision-making processes. The key insight was that terrorists made rational decisions based on incomplete information. And by controlling what information they received, American forces could manipulate their responses in ways that created tactical advantages. Dr. Rodriguez recognized the revolutionary implications of my work and arranged for me to present my findings to a classified Pentagon working group on special operations effectiveness. The presentation took place in a windowless conference room deep within the Pentagon, where I briefed a collection of colonels, generals, intelligence officials who had been struggling with declining success rates in hostage rescue operations. My analysis explained not only why recent missions had failed, but provided specific recommendations for improving future operational planning through better deception and information warfare techniques. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. General Patricia Morrison, who commanded Special Operations Command, requested detailed briefings on how my methodology could be implemented in current operational planning. Within weeks, I was consulting on active missions, providing analysis that helped special operations planners anticipate enemy responses and develop countermeasures that significantly improved mission success rates. The theoretical frameworks I developed in academic isolation were proving their value in life and death situations where American lives hung in the balance. The Syrian hostage crisis became my first major test case, when 43 American contractors were captured by a sophisticated terrorist cell that had successfully evaded multiple rescue attempts by conventional special operations forces. The group's leader, known as the engineer, had demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate American tactical approaches, moving hostages to new locations just hours before rescue teams arrived at their targets. Previous attempts had failed, because the engineer seemed to possess almost supernatural awareness of coalition force movements and operational planning. My analysis of the group's communication patterns and movement history revealed that they were not psychic, but methodical, using a network of informants and electronic surveillance to monitor American activities around their operational area. By mapping their intelligence network and identifying the specific indicators they relied upon to detect incoming operations, I was able to design a deception plan that would feed them false information while concealing the actual rescue operation, until it was too late for them to respond effectively. The plan involved creating multiple false scenarios simultaneously, each designed to trigger specific responses from the engineer's organization. While terrorist spotters were tracking decoy convoys moving toward fabricated target locations, the actual rescue team was approaching from an entirely different direction using infiltration routes that the enemy's surveillance network couldn't monitor. The deception was so complete that the terrorists began moving hostages to defend against threats that didn't exist, ultimately concentrating them in a location that made the actual rescue significantly easier to execute. The operation's success exceeded everyone's expectations. All 43 hostages were recovered without casualties, while the engineer and 17 of his followers were either killed or captured during the assault. More importantly, the success demonstrated that my analytical methods could be translated into practical operational advantages that saved American lives and achieved strategic objectives. The classified after-action report credited the mission's success to innovative intelligence, analysis, and operational deception techniques that revolutionized special operations planning. General Morrison personally called to congratulate me on the results and to discuss expanding my role in special operations planning. She explained that the Pentagon was establishing a new analytical unit focused on developing unconventional approaches to complex military challenges, and she wanted me to lead the team responsible for hostage rescue operations. The position would come with a security clearance that exceeded what most active duty officers possessed and access to intelligence resources that could support far more ambitious analytical projects. The offer represented everything I had been working toward since beginning my academic transformation. The opportunity to contribute meaningfully to national security, while utilizing skills that had emerged from my combat experience and intellectual development. More importantly, it provided a path back into military service that transcended the physical limitations that had ended my conventional career. I would be serving my country not as a broken soldier accepting charity, but as an expert whose insights were essential for protecting American lives and advancing national interests. The irony was not lost on me that the injury, which had convinced Sarah I was unemployable, was actually the catalyst for developing capabilities that made me more valuable than I had ever been as a conventional infantry officer. The limitations she had seen as permanent disabilities were becoming the foundation for contributions that exceeded anything I could have achieved following a traditional military career path. The David Chen she had abandoned was evolving into Marcus's ghost Reeves, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was already spreading through the special operations community. Like wildfire through dry grass, the position was special operations. Command came with resources and access that transformed my analytical capabilities from academic exercises into operational weapons. General Morrison assigned me a team of 12 analysts, linguists, and technical specialists, along with a classified budget that allowed us to purchase intelligence from sources that traditional military channels couldn't access. Our unit, officially designated as the Strategic Analysis Group, but known informally as Ghost Team, operated from a secure facility in Quantico with direct communication links to combat units operating in 17 different countries. Within 6 months, we had revolutionized how the American military approached complex rescue operations. My predictive models, refined through access to real-time intelligence and operational feedback, achieved success rates that seemed almost impossible to senior commanders who had grown accustomed to failure and compromise. We didn't just rescue hostages. We dismantled entire terrorist networks by anticipating their responses and manipulating their decision-making processes in ways that turned their own operational security against them. The breakthrough that established my reputation came during the Libyan embassy crisis. Diplomatic personnel were trapped in Tripoli while competing militia groups fought for control of the city. Traditional evacuation methods were impossible due to the chaotic security situation, and previous attempts by Marine Corps rescue teams had been repelled with heavy casualties. The situation seemed hopeless until my team developed an operation that used the militia conflict itself as cover for extracting the diplomats. Instead of fighting through the militias, we fed intelligence to both sides that caused them to focus their attention on each other while creating a corridor of relative safety through which our forces could operate. The evacuation succeeded brilliantly, with all embassy personnel extracted without a single American casualty, while the competing militias remained convinced that their enemies had somehow outmaneuvered them. The operation's success was so complete that it took months before anyone realized that American forces had been responsible for manipulating the entire tactical situation. My reputation within the special operations community grew with each successful mission, but I maintained strict operational security about my true identity. Marcus Ghost Reeves became known as a mysterious figure whose analytical brilliance bordered on the supernatural. Someone who could predict enemy behavior with uncanny accuracy and design operations that seemed to bend reality to achieve impossible objectives. Very few people knew that Ghost was actually David Chen, the medically retired infantry captain whose career had supposedly ended in an Afghan minefield. The transformation accelerated when the Pentagon created a new position specifically for me, Director of Unconventional Operations Analysis, with a rank equivalent to full colonel and access to intelligence resources that rivaled what was available to three-star generals. The appointment came with a personal security detail and a budget that allowed me to establish analytical teams in multiple geographic regions, each focused on specific types of threats and operational challenges. Within 3 years, my methods had been adopted by NATO forces, Israeli special operations, and select allied militaries around the world. The success brought unexpected personal satisfaction beyond professional achievement. The chronic pain from my leg injury had become manageable through better medical treatment and physical conditioning, while the PTSD symptoms had largely disappeared, as I found renewed purpose in work that clearly saved lives and protected American interests. The broken soldier that Sarah had abandoned had become one of the most influential figures in modern military operations, though very few people knew his real name or understood the journey that had brought him to such prominence. The irony reached its peak when I learned that Sarah Hamilton had been appointed as Secretary of Defense, making her the senior civilian official responsible for overseeing the very special operations that my team planned and executed. She had married Jonathan Hamilton 3 years after our engagement ended, used his family connections to secure high-profile legal positions, and eventually transitioned into politics as a defense policy expert. Her confirmation hearings had emphasized her military law background and her commitment to supporting America's special operations forces, the very capabilities that I had helped to revolutionize. The assignment that would bring our paths together again came through a classified presidential directive requiring a briefing on special operations capabilities to the newly appointed Secretary of Defense. General Morrison selected me personally to conduct the briefing, explaining that my success rate and innovative approaches made me the obvious choice to represent special operations to the Pentagon's senior leadership. The meeting was scheduled for Conference Room Alpha 7. It's the same secure facility where the nation's most sensitive military decisions were made. As I walked down that marble corridor in my dress uniform, medals gleaming on my chest in confidence. Radiating from every step, I carried with me the knowledge that the woman who had once discarded me, as broken and worthless now, depended on my expertise to fulfill her responsibilities as Secretary of Defense. She would be briefed by Marcus Ghost Reeves without realizing that she was facing David Chen, the man whose potential she had so catastrophically underestimated when she chose security over loyalty in that hospital room 8 years earlier. If you found this story of transformation and redemption compelling, there's so much more where this came from. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join our community of viewers who believe that setbacks are just setups for comebacks. Every week we bring you true stories of people who turned their darkest moments into their greatest triumphs. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives of resilience, revenge, and ultimately redemption. Don't miss the next chapter of human determination. Subscribe now and become part of our growing family of inspiration seekers. Remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person others said you could never be.